Hi, welcome to Creation Care Church Friday Night Live message. And this week we're going to be looking at Clement and the Clementine Homilies. So today we're going to be focusing primarily on who is Clement and what are the Clementine Homilies. And then we're going to be talking further about the Clementine Homilies in the next 3 weeks, where we're going to be going over specific topics related to them. So Clement and the Clementine Homilies, this is based on Philippians 4, verses 2 and 3, which says, I implore Euodia and I implore Syntyche to be of the same mind in the Lord. And I urge you also, true companion, help these women who labored with me in the gospel, with Clement also, and the rest of my fellow workers whose names are in the book of life. So here in the Bible, in the letter to the Philippians, Paul is saying, my fellow workers, including Clement, whose name is in the book of life. So this is the Clement that we're talking about in today's talk and in the talks that will be happening the next few weeks. So the question, who is Clement of Rome? What are the Clementine Homilies? How can these writings help us to better understand the original teachings of Jesus and the apostles? So that's what we're going to be touching on today. So now before we get started, a few announcements. One is that this link, which I just put in the chat for our link tree, this gives us, that provides links to the fellowship and to Discord and to everything else that we do. And so after today's talk, immediately following it, so an hour from right now, we have fellowship on Zoom. And anytime that, let's say you want fellowship throughout the week, we also have a Discord channel, and we have a link to that on our link tree. And we just updated that, by the way. So if you've tried to join in the past and got an error message, we just fixed that. So hopefully you'll be able to join it now. And if we ever, for whatever reason, have to cancel Zoom fellowship, then Discord is the backup. So if you ever want to do that, that's how you can get there. And also, if you'd like to become a member of Creation Care Church, which it doesn't cost anything, it doesn't obligate you to anything, but it means that you would be officially recognized as a member of our church. And the one perk for doing so is that you get added to our newsletter. So we have a quarterly newsletter that we send out with some useful information and encouragement. So if you'd like to receive that 4 times a year, then you could do so by going to our website, creationcarechurch.org. And at the bottom of the homepage, there's you just put in your name and your email, and that immediately signs you up. Then you're officially a member of Creation Care Church. So then you can tell people this is my church, which actually you can do anyway. But this would just make it official. And then lastly, if you would like to receive pamphlets, so we have our Creation Care Church pamphlets, which if you haven't seen them, you can go to our website and look up our pamphlets. And if you'd like some for yourself to hand out to people, then you can email info@creationcarechurch.org and tell us how many you would like us to send to you and where to send them. So you'd want your name and address, and then we can get those to you, and you could help spread the word about Creation Care Church. All right, so now let's begin with the word of prayer, and then we will start with today's talk. Our Father in heaven, thank you for all the people that you've brought here today and that will hear this message afterwards. We just ask for your guidance as we go through this historical topic about who is Clement and sort of introducing these Clementine homilies and how they are significant for understanding some of these concepts that are in the New Testament that aren't as elaborated on as they are in the homilies. So just give us insight and wisdom as we go through this message today. In Jesus' name, amen. So Clement and the Clementine Homilies. As I said, this is the first of a series of 4 talks. Today we're going to be talking primarily about Clement and introducing the Clementine Homilies. Then in the next 3 weeks, we are going to be talking about the true prophet doctrine, also known as the prophet like Moses. Then we're going to be looking at the key of the kingdom, or the key of knowledge, or the key of David. Those are sort of different terms for the same thing. And then we're going to be looking at the table of demons third, which says you can't sit at the table of the Lord in the table of demons. and doesn't say a whole lot else besides that. But then in the homilies, it elaborates much more thoroughly on these three topics. And so we're going to be focusing on those the next 3 weeks instead of trying to jam it all into this talk tonight. All right, so today we're looking at Clement. So some questions. What do you know about Clement and or the Clementine Homilies? So tell us in the comments as we go and ask any questions that you have, and we will address the comments and questions in the second half of the talk. So give me a little bit of background as to how familiar you are with Clement or the homilies. So now, who is Clement? Paul says Clement is a worker in spreading the gospel. So in Philippians chapter 4, verses 2 and 3, he says, I urge Euodia and Syntyche to agree with each other in the Lord. Yes, and I ask you, my true yokefellow, to help these women who have labored with me for the gospel, along with Clement and the rest of my fellow workers whose names are in the book of life. So just to highlight Clement, I literally just highlighted Clement in green, or not green, orange. Unless you're colorblind, then it might be green, which apparently I am. And so that's who we're talking about. Now, another place that Clement comes up, and this is in the Shepherd of Hermas, which for those who are unfamiliar with the Shepherd of Hermas, this is an ancient text that almost made it into the Bible. This was one of those texts, kind of like the book of Revelation, that was 50-50, where some people put it in, some people left it out, and ultimately it got left out and Revelation was put in. But this is one of those texts that was very popular in the early church that almost made it into the Bible. And in it, Hermas says Clement is responsible for corresponding with foreign cities. You will therefore write 2 little books, and you will send one to Clement and one to Grapte. Grapte, therefore, will send his to the cities without, for permission has been granted to him to do so. But Grapte will admonish the widows and the orphans. But you will read it in this city with the elders who preside over the church. So this is just giving a little bit of background about what Clement's role is as the Bishop of Rome, is corresponding with other cities. Now, Irenaeus in Against Heresies 3.3.2 and 3, and this is repeated in Eusebius Church History 5.6.1 through 5. Irenaeus says Clement was the 3rd bishop of Rome after its establishment by the apostles. It says, the blessed apostles, having found and established the church, entrusted the office of the episcopate to Linus. Paul speaks of this Linus in his epistles to Timothy. Anacletus succeeded him, and after Anacletus in the 3rd place from the apostles, Clement received the episcopate. So this is the first version, not first, but like the one of the 2 versions of Clement as Bishop of Rome, where it's saying it was established by the apostles, and then there was Linus, then Anacletus, then Clement. So there's 2 generations of bishops between Clement and the apostles. Okay, so keep that in mind. Now, Irenaeus also says that Clement had firsthand familiarity with the preaching of the apostles. Irenaeus says he had seen and conversed with the blessed apostles, and their preaching was still sounding in his ears, and their tradition was still before his eyes. Nor was he alone in this, for many who had been taught by the apostles yet survived. So now here, Irenaeus is saying that Clement actually knew the apostles and conversed with them. So the first question to ask here, if you're asking Irenaeus, which, 1,800 years later, he's probably not going to give you a response, but you want to ask yourself, well, which is it? Is it that Clement is talking with the apostles and knows the apostles and is interacting with them in the time of the apostles? Or is it that there are these 2 generations separating Clement from the apostles, namely Linus and Anacletus are separating them? So just keep that in mind as we go through the rest of this information. So Irenaeus attests that Clement was part of an unbroken order of succession of preaching of the truth from the apostles to Irenaeus. So he says Everestus succeeded Clement, and Alexander succeeded Everestus. Then Xistus, the 6th from the apostles, was appointed. After him, Telesphorus, who suffered martyrdom gloriously. Then Hyginus, then Pius. Then after him, Anicetus. Soter succeeded Anicetus, and now in the 12th place from the apostles, Eleutherus holds the office of bishop. In the same order and succession, the tradition in the church and the preaching of the truth has descended from the apostles unto us. Now, it's not important that we remember all those names. The important point here is that Irenaeus is admitting that Clement plays an important role in this chain of bishops that goes from the apostles and then to Irenaeus. So he acknowledges that Clement was a really important person and that he was an early bishop. The only question is he that first bishop, or is he that or are there two bishops separating him from the apostles? Now, Tertullian, so Irenaeus is writing around the year 180, so toward the end of the 2nd century. Now we have Tertullian, who's writing around the year 200, so at the very end of the 2nd century, and this is from Prescription Against Heretics 32.2. Tertullian claims Clement was ordained in Rome by the Apostle Peter. He says, "For this is the manner in which the apostolic churches transmit their census registers. Just as the church of the Smyrnians records that Polycarp was located there by John, just as that of the Romans records that Clement was ordained by Peter." So what he's saying here is that you have this church of Smyrna, and that was established by John. John sort of established all of the Asia Minor churches, so with like Galatia, Ephesus, Smyrna, all those places in Asia Minor. And he established Polycarp as that first bishop of Smyrna. Now, similarly, the Church of Rome was established by Peter, and he put Clement in charge as his successor, just like John put Polycarp as the successor in the Church of Smyrna. So this is according to Tertullian, and he's saying that my evidence for this is that the church itself says this. So if you go to the church in Smyrna in the year 200, when Tertullian's writing, this is the claim he's making, then it'll say that John established it and then appointed Polycarp as that first bishop. And if you go to the church in Rome, it says Peter established it and made Clement that first bishop. So this is evidence for this sort of alternate history where you have two different claims. You have one that claims that Peter directly ordained Clement to succeed Peter. And you have this other tradition that says, no, actually it was Linus and Anacletus before Clement. So there were these two sort of bishops in between the apostles and Clement. So the question is, well, which one is it? Because they can't both be true. One has to be the real history and one has to be the not real history. So which one's which? Well, the first question, I think, which I said this is what you should keep in mind, is that when Irenaeus is saying that, no, there was Anacletus and Linus separating Clement from the apostles, he also admits that Clement knew the apostles, and he says he conversed with them directly. So it's like if he knew them directly, then why would there be two generations of bishops separating him from the apostles? So that should give you a clue that as to which one is probably more accurate. So now if we go to Eusebius, who's writing toward the beginning of the 4th century, around the year 325, somewhere around there. Eusebius, in his History of the Church, 3.15 and 16, Eusebius attests that Clement, spoken of by Paul, is the same Clement who became the Bishop of Rome. So he says, and in the 12th year of the same rule, Clement succeeded Anacletus after he had been bishop of the Church of Rome for 12 years. The apostle, writing an epistle to the Philippians, talking about Paul, teaches that this Clement became his fellow worker, saying, with Clement also and the rest of my fellow workers, whose names are in the book of life. And that's the passage that we read from Philippians. So Eusebius is acknowledging that this is the same Clement that we're talking about, is the Clement that Paul was talking about as his fellow worker. But he's following this history of bishops that Irenaeus suggested, where there's this Cletus or Anacletus and Linus that separate Clement from the apostles, namely Peter. Now, Eusebius also, in History of the Church 3.21, he attests that Paul and Peter first established the church in Rome, and that Clement later held the position of Bishop of Rome after Linus and Anacletus. He says, Trajan succeeded Nerva after he had reigned a little more than a year, during the first year of whom Cerdon succeeded Abilius, which these names are not important to remember, who had ruled the Church of Alexandria for 13 years. This man was the third that presided over that church after Anianus, who was the first. And at that time, Clement still led the Church of Rome, being also himself the third in line that held the episcopate there after Paul and Peter. And Linus was the first, and after him, Anacletus. So again, Eusebius is sort of following this history that has Anacletus and Linus in between the apostles and Clement. And it looks like what Eusebius is doing is he's using Irenaeus as one of his sources for this tradition, but then he's trying to sort of harmonize these two traditions that he knows about. Now, Irenaeus admits that Clement knew the apostles and yet tries to separate him from the apostles by 2 generations. So now Eusebius, trying to harmonize those two together, is like, yeah, it was established by Paul and Peter, but there were these 2 intervening bishops. Now, Jerome, who's writing sort of at the end of the 4th century, on Famous Men 15, he acknowledges Clement is the one Paul attests to as a worker in the spreading of the gospel. He says, Clement, concerning whom the apostle Paul, writing to the Philippians, says, with Clement and the others of my fellow workers whose names have been written in the book of life. Again, there's that same passage that we started out with, Philippians 4, verses 2 and 3. This is exactly what Jerome is referencing. So everyone is in agreement that this is the Clement that we're talking about. Okay, so that's the one thing they all agree with, is that this is the same Clement that Paul is talking about. So the only question is he that first bishop that was established by Peter directly, or was he someone who came with 2 generations of bishops between him and the apostles? That's the only point of contention here. And I'll tell you why that's important when we sort of get to the end. So now Jerome attests to a debate as to whether Clement was the 2nd or 4th bishop of the Church of Rome. He says, the 4th bishop of Rome after Peter, if indeed the 2nd was Linus and the 3rd Anacletus, although most of the Latins think that Clement was 2nd after Peter the apostle. So this is interesting. You have Tertullian in the year 200 who's saying that the church records of the Church of Rome, which would have been established like 150 years or so before Tertullian, so he's within that realm of being, he might have actually seen them himself, or he might have just been reiterating what someone else told him, but those records would have still been in existence 150 years after the church's establishment in the time of Tertullian. So he's saying the church records themselves say that Peter established it and that he gave it directly to Clement. And now Jerome is saying in the year 400, so 200 years after Tertullian, that the Latins, which is basically those who comprise the Church of Rome, he's saying they all say that Peter directly ordained Clement and that Clement directly followed Peter, that there weren't these intervening bishops of Linus and Anacletus, as some outside of Rome claim. So this is really interesting that if you go back to the actual records, it says that it was directly Peter then Clement. And if you go to the people who comprise that church, even 350 years later at the time of Jerome, they all continue with that history that is consistent with the records of that church. And it's only people outside of that region that are trying to claim that no, there were these intervening bishops that separated Clement from the apostles. Now, Photius, who's writing considerably longer, this is the middle of the 9th century. He's the Archbishop of Constantinople. In Bibliotheca 112 and 113, Photius reiterates the continued debate over Clement being the 2nd or 4th bishop of Rome. He says, some say that Clement succeeded Peter as bishop of Rome, others that he was the 4th bishop, Linus and Anacletus intervening, and that he died in the 3rd year of the reign of Trajan. So apparently, even into the 9th century, there was this debate as to which one has the right history. Now, Peter ordains Clement according to, there's these 2 introductory letters that are attached to the beginning of the Clementine Homilies. One is a letter that purports to be a letter from Peter to James, who's head of the Church of Jerusalem. And the other one is a letter from Clement to James. And now in the letter that's by Clement to James, this is where this passage comes from. But even though it's a letter from Clement to James, this is Peter speaking in this portion of that letter. So here he said, this is Peter speaking, since as I have been taught by the Lord and teacher Jesus Christ, whose apostle I am, the day of my death is approaching. So he's writing this near the end of his life. I lay hands upon this Clement as your bishop, and to him I entrust my chair of discourse, even to him who has journeyed with me from the beginning to the end, and thus has heard all of my homilies, or all of my teachings, all of my sermons, who, in a word, having had a share in all my trials, has been found steadfast in the faith, whom I have found above all others pious, philanthropic, pure, learned, chaste, good, upright, large-hearted, and striving generously to bear the ingratitude of some of the catechumens. So he's very patient with people who are unthankful to what they have to offer. But he has all of these wonderful qualities, and according to Peter here, he has been following Peter and is very well acquainted with all the teachings that Peter received from his teacher, Jesus. And so the succession basically goes, Jesus taught Peter and all the other apostles, and then Peter had Clement as his primary disciple, who learned all these things from Peter, who Peter learned from Jesus, and then Peter established Clement as the Bishop of Rome to succeed him. So this is the history according to the Clementine Homilies. So the reason why these two histories, I think, are important is because the one acknowledges that there is this direct relationship between Peter and Clement, and that there's these detailed teachings as preserved in the Clementine Homilies and some of these other texts that we'll talk about that go directly from Clement to Peter, and that these teachings are actually Peter that come from Jesus. And then there's this alternate history that says, no. Clement wasn't this disciple of Peter, and all these teachings that claim to be things that Clement, the disciple of Peter, got from Peter, who got from Jesus. We can just discount all those things because he wasn't even the disciple of Peter. Peter established the church alongside Paul, and then there was Linus, then Anacletus, and only then came Clement generations later. So we can discount all those things that pretend that Clement was the disciple of Peter and got all these teachings from Peter. So that's kind of the line of thinking. And of course, if you go to the Church of Rome itself, according to Tertullian, they claim that this is the right history, that Clement was the direct successor of Peter and that Peter himself ordained him. And if you go to Jerome, Jerome says, well, even in the 4th century, the entire Church of Rome acknowledges this history, that Clement got this position directly from the Apostle Peter. And then if you go back to Irenaeus, who's our earliest source for this alternate history of Linus and Anacletus being there, he himself admits in another passage that we looked at that Clement knew the apostles directly, that there wasn't this intervening 2 generations between Clement and the apostles. So even Irenaeus, who's the source of this second narrative of 2 bishops separating him, he himself admits that Clement knew the apostles. So I think that if we're looking for what the real history is, I think that the preponderance of the evidence suggests that the real history is that Clement directly succeeded Peter, and that Peter, the apostle of Jesus, established Clement to sort of fill this role in his place. So now that we know that that's sort of the history of Clement, then of course that sheds new light on, well, how important are these Clementine homilies? Should they just be ignored and said, oh, well, that's some alternate history? Or is this the real history that was sort of tried to be covered up? And now a little bit of other biographical information. So this is found in the Clementine Homilies. This is Homilies 5.28. Clement was educated in Greek philosophy, converted to Judaism, and became a disciple of Peter. And keep in mind that at this point, Christianity was considered a sect of Judaism, because we're still talking about the middle of the 1st century. And he says, and this is Clement speaking, I was not enamored of the woman or of anyone else, my soul being exceedingly spent upon other desires and upon the investigation of true doctrines. And till now, although I have examined many doctrines of philosophers, I have inclined to none of them, excepting only that of the Jews, a certain merchant of theirs having sojourned here in Rome, selling linen clothes, and a fortunate meeting, having set simply before me the doctrine of the unity of God. So he's saying, unlike most of the young men my age, I wasn't trying to chase after women and get married and start a family. He's like, I wasn't pursuing those things. I wanted to know what's the truth. And elsewhere in the homilies, he elaborates more on this, and he says that he really wants to know whether the soul is immortal. And he went through all these different Greek philosophies, and he found none of them satisfactory. And it wasn't until he met this person that he says was a Jew who was selling linen clothes in Rome, these fine wedding garments, that he had this conversion. He's like, this is it. And then he met Barnabas, and Barnabas introduced him to Peter, and that he basically became the disciple of Peter for the rest of the story. And then Peter made him the Bishop of Rome. So that's basically Clement's background according to the homilies. So now, again, there's these two competing histories. So the question is, was Clement the successor of Peter, or were there two bishops separating Peter and Clement? And I sort of already went over why people might be motivated to sort of have these two alternate histories, or at least make up this sort of second story in order to downplay the significance of this history of Clement knowing Peter. So now let's talk a little bit about the Clementine literature. So the first is the Clementine Homilies, which we're going to be talking about at length over the rest of this month. And there's also the letter of Peter to James concerning Clement, and the letter of Clement to James. So those are two short letters that are affixed to sort of the beginning of the homilies, which it's unclear exactly what the connection is supposed to be, but it's basically just material that is sort of attached to it somehow. And then we also have this other text that's called the Recognitions of Clement. And this is translated by Rufinus in the 4th century. And the most important, or at least the most widely used part of that text, is what's known as the Ascents of James. And that is what comprises book 1 of the Recognitions. And this is actually one of the source texts for the book of Acts. So we know that it predates the year 170. So it's unclear sort of what this relationship is between the Recognitions and the homilies, because they share a whole bunch of material, a lot of times verbatim of each other, but then they also have a lot of material that's independent, that's either in the Recognitions and not the homilies, or it's in the homilies and not the Recognitions. Now, there's a third one that's known as the Syriac manuscript, which, according to dating techniques, the range is sort of around the 4th or 5th century. And at the top of it, it has the number 411 on it, which scholars have come to believe is the date that they believe that this manuscript was either created or copied or something. And so they just call this the Syriac manuscript. And so we have these three texts. We have the Clementine Homilies, the Recognitions of Clement, and this 411 Syriac manuscript. And they all share a clear relationship where there's large chunks of text that are verbatim copies of each other or approximate copies of each other. And it almost looks like the relationship between Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the synoptic gospels, where there's a whole bunch of stories that overlap. Some details are different. Some stories are in Matthew, but not in Mark or Luke. Some stories are in Matthew and Mark, but not Luke. Some are in Matthew and Luke, but not Mark. And so that's kind of what we see with the Recognitions, the homilies, and the Syriac manuscript. And so just like they call it the synoptic problem, trying to figure out what the relationship of dependency is between Matthew, Mark, and Luke, there's a similar problem here of what's the relationship between the Recognitions, the homilies, and the Syriac manuscript. And so without going into it into too much detail, I'm personally convinced that for a variety of reasons, that the material that's unique to the homilies is some material that definitely goes back to Peter and Clement and Jesus. And so we're going to look at some of that material that helps us to better understand some things in the Bible. Oh, and then at the bottom, there's also 1st Clement and 2nd Clement, which First Clement was a letter to the Church of Corinth. So it's similar to the letter to the Corinthians, where it's trying to get them to stop disagreeing with each other and accept the authority of the bishop. And then there's Second Clement, which is like a contentious letter that, it's sort of unclear what the relationship is between those two and these other texts, whether these are texts that are intended to sort of replace these other ones and aren't really by Clement, or whether it's all by Clement, or what the relationship is. But I just want to make you aware that those are also letters that are attributed to Clement. So now, when we're trying to figure out the Clementine Homilies, what's the earliest possible dating and the latest possible dating for it? So the earliest possible dating would be in the time of Clement and Peter, which would be the middle of the 1st century. So if this is actually just an exactly preserved document that Clement himself wrote, then it would be the middle of the 1st century. But then what we do when we're trying to date these ancient manuscripts is we want to have a lower limit and an upper limit. So the upper limit would be the first clear attestation to it that is sort of undeniable, that it had to exist at this time in order to be attested to. And so the latest possible date would be Eusebius, who acknowledges that he recently became aware of lengthy writings attributed to Clement containing dialogues of Peter and Appian. He says, "And certain men have recently put forth verbose and lengthy writings under his name containing dialogues of Peter and Appian, of which writings no mention has been made by the ancients," meaning the earlier proto-Orthodox people, "for they do not even preserve the pure character of apostolic orthodoxy." So they present views that are contrary to the proto-Orthodox views that emerged at the end of the 2nd century. If this refers to Homilies books 4, 5, and 6, which it does mention Appian and dialogues with Peter and Appian, then this establishes an upper limit date of 325 for the extant version of the Clementine Homilies. So this would be the latest possible dating for the homilies. So one thing when it comes to these ancient texts, we often see an original version and then an edited version, sometimes multiple edited versions, especially texts that are particularly important and are well circulated. We tend to see a variety of different versions of it. And so, for instance, the Gospels, we have multiple versions of some of the Gospels. And here we have multiple versions of the Clementine literature. We have the homilies, we have the Syriac version, and we have the recognitions. So it's clearly a very influential text in the early church. And we know that the version of the homilies that we have, this fuller version that has this Appian material in it, that the latest possible dating is 325. So the question, how much of the Clementine literature is authentic? What material goes back to Clement, Peter, and Jesus? The date range would be 550 to 325. Now, who would have composed what portions, when, and for what purpose? These are some of the more important questions in my mind, and definitely very important questions to try to figure out who composed what. So what group and time period best represents the teachings contained in the homilies? So if we go through the material, which we're going to sort of introduce some of it, but only really a taste of it because it's a large book with, it's actually 20 books combined, we find that the teachings that are contained in it most closely resemble what these same proto-Orthodox people, these historians like Eusebius and the author of the Panarion, Epiphanius and Irenaeus and all these people, Hegesippus, the groups that share these teachings are what's known as the Ebionites or the Nazarenes. And so the Ebionites and the Nazarenes, as we've looked at in previous talks, we've gone over in the school, discipleship school, is those are the terms that the Bible uses to refer to the original apostles of Jesus. So the teachings that correspond to these groups are the teachings of Jesus and the apostles. So this would, I think, present a case for it being earlier. Now, just to sort of play the position of, well, let's assume that it's not that, because if it is authentically going back to Jesus and the apostles, then that would be the end of it. That would be a settled case that we should just accept this stuff as the authentic teachings of Jesus and the apostles. But just to play, like, what is the opposite view if we want to have the sort of most skeptical view of the homilies? Well, the most skeptical view would be that it was composed sort of at the beginning of the 4th century or the end of the 3rd century, by people who rejected the proto-Orthodox view in favor of these views that correspond more closely to the teachings of Jesus and the apostles. So it would have been these sort of late 3rd century Ebionite Nazarenes that refused to conform to the proto-Orthodox views that deviated from the teachings of Jesus and the apostles. So those are sort of the two options that we have. It's not, this is some person who made a bunch of stuff up that we could all just ignore. No, that's not one of the options. The two options are, this is material that authentically goes back to Jesus and Peter and Clement, or it's material that's held by later generations of those who followed them that rejected this proto-Orthodox takeover of Christianity in the late 2nd century. So those are the two options as to where this material came from. And either way, they would be preserving traditions that go back to Jesus and the apostles, that sort of sidesteps this sort of rewriting of history by the proto-Orthodoxy. So in either event, if all we're trying to do is use the concepts that are conveyed in these texts to help us understand concepts that are in the New Testament, then it would work whichever one is the case. So for our purposes, for the next few sermons or live talks, it doesn't really matter which of it is. So now, just to give you a heads up as to sort of what we're going to be doing over the next few weeks, we have the talk today, which Clementine Homilies, and then we're going to be doing the prophet like Moses, also known as the true prophet doctrine. Then we're going to do the key of knowledge, or the key of David, the key of the kingdom, and then the table of demons. So the prophet like Moses, just to give you a heads up, it's from Acts 3:22, where it says, for Moses said, the Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from among the brothers. You must listen to him in everything he tells you, Acts 3:22. And this is based on Deuteronomy 18:18, which says, I will raise up for them a prophet like you, Moses, from among their brethren, and will put my words in his mouth, and he shall speak to them all that I command him. Then the key of knowledge, or the key of David, the key of the kingdom, is from Isaiah 22:22. It says, I will place on his shoulders the key to the house of David. What he opens, no one can shut, and what he shuts, no one can open. Then in Revelation chapter 3, verses 7 and 8, it says, to the angel of the church in Philadelphia, write, these are the words of the one who is holy and true, who holds the key of David. Who's that? Jesus. What he opens, no one can shut, and what he shuts, no one can open. I know your deeds. See, I have placed before you an open door, which no one can shut, for you have only a little strength, yet you have kept my word and have not denied my name. So the Church of Philadelphia is one of the 7 churches that he found nothing wrong with. All the other ones, there was at least one thing they were doing wrong. And also about the keys of the kingdom, it says, woe to you lawyers, for you have taken away the keys of knowledge. You did not enter in yourselves, and those who are entering in you hindered. This is Luke 11:52. And interestingly, this is if what I'm suggesting is accurate, that the proto-Orthodoxy sort of covered up this history of Clement and the Clementine Homilies, well, they're doing exactly what Jesus accused the Pharisees of doing, that they had access to these keys to the kingdom and they hid them from other people. Now, Jesus hands Peter the keys to the kingdom. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. That's Matthew 16:19. Then Peter taught to Clement what Jesus passed on to him concerning the key of knowledge, and Clement passed it on to us by recording it in the homilies. So the line of transmission goes Jesus to Peter to Clement. And now the last topic is the table of demons, where in 1 Corinthians 10, verse 21, it says, you cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of demons too. You cannot have a part in both the Lord's table and the table of demons. And in the Clementine Homilies 7.8, it says to abstain from the table of devils, that is, from food offered to idols, from dead carcasses, from animals which have been suffocated or caught by wild beasts, and from blood, not to live any longer impurely. So the Clementine Homilies is elaborating more on what this table of demons or table of devils is. And part of what that means is you're not eating dead bodies, you're not eating blood, you're not eating this product of violence, you're no longer living impurely, which is very reminiscent of the conclusion of the Jerusalem Council in Acts 15. So it's that's essentially what it means to walk by the Holy Spirit. And so that's what we're going to be looking at in the next 3 talks, is those 3 topics and what the Clementine Homilies has to say to help shed light on these concepts. Okay, so now let's go to the Q&A. So here's the link to the link tree if you want to join us for fellowship afterwards, or you want to find our website where you can join the church membership or order pamphlets. This is the place to do it, or joining Discord, anything else. See Tim, hi from Kathy and Tim from Ohio. Hello, Kathy and Tim. We have multiple Kathy and Tims, so hello to all the Kathy and Tims that are joining us. See Rosalind, welcome everyone. Greetings from Leeds, UK. Hello, Rosalind. Welcome. Luke, hello everyone. Hello, Luke. Fred, hi from California. Hi, Fred. Live Mercifully, hi CCC family, watching from California. Hi, Live Mercifully. Blake from Dallas. Hi, Blake. Jonathan, blessings from upstate New York. Blessings, Jonathan. Tanya, hello from Ohio. Hello, Tanya. Annemiek, hello everybody from Holland. Hi, Annemiek. There's the other Kathy and Tim. Hi, Kathy. Everyone from Minnesota, welcome. Welcome, Kathy. Heidi, hello from Tennessee. Hello, Heidi. And this looks like it's Teddy, shared at this group. Awesome. Thanks, Teddy. What all religions have in common is that there is no place in any religion in the world that requires eating animals. Well, I can't think of one, I guess, that requires it. I know that some people say that at the Passover, it's a sin to not eat lamb. So I guess forms of Torah observant groups would require it. And I don't know who else. I guess anyone who thinks that vegans are all following a demon, I guess anyone who holds that view, whatever their religion would consist of, they would claim that. But yeah, certainly the religion of Creation Care Church, we believe that it's not that at all. We believe that, in fact, it's God's will from the beginning that we're not supposed to be eating animals. So that's definitely our perspective. I can't speak for everyone, whatever someone claims their religion is, okay, that's their religion, but I know this is my religion, this is our religion. See, Sean, well said. Awesome. Thanks for being here, Sean. Shirley, hello from Melbourne. Hi, Shirley. Fred, could not the 2 bishops in between have had short terms, and then Clement, who had spoken with some apostles, have become bishop after them? Okay, good question. And that would theoretically be possible. The one issue with this is that if there were these 2 intervening bishops, let's say it was first Peter, and then it was Linus, and then it was Anacletus, and then it was Clement. Well, who would have been the one ordaining Clement? Well, it would have been Anacletus who would have ordained Clement. It wouldn't have been Peter. So if we're saying that Peter is the one who established and ordained Clement, well, he wouldn't be the one doing that if he already gave it away to Linus, who gave it away to Anacletus. So it would have been Anacletus who would have established Clement as the bishop. And so if we have one tradition that says Anacletus is the one who passed it on to Clement, and another one that says it was Peter who passed it on, then those can't both be true. So that would be sort of the contentious there. And another line that I entertained that I thought sort of could be plausible, but the more I think about it, I think that it's more likely that that the intervening bishops was sort of a different narrative that was created in the 2nd century, is that, let's say Paul established a church in Rome, and then he appointed Linus, and then Linus appointed Anacletus, and then Peter comes to Rome and establishes a different church in Rome and appoints Clement as the leader of it. And then you have Anacletus and you have Clement, and Anacletus says, you know what, I'm giving it to Clement, who Peter established. And so now it's sort of joining Paul's Rome church with Peter's Rome church. And so Clement sort of brings the two together. I could see that maybe as being a possible explanation of how both can be true. And I guess if that's the case, then that would present the version where Peter establishes Clement, that history that's contained within the Clementine Homilies, that one would be true. Maybe the other one is also true, but this one would certainly be corroborated. So good question, and that's how I would think about that. Let's see, Sean, when do these start? I come to get something out of context again. Okay, are you talking about the FNL messages? They start at 4 o'clock Pacific, and that's 7 p.m. Eastern time. So if you go to the, let's say the Facebook page or the YouTube channel, and when it says upcoming talks, then you could click on it and it should have the time that's adjusted to your own region, whatever your time zone is, whatever you have your Facebook or YouTube set to. So then you could just look and it'll tell you when it's happening according to your time zone. I hope that's your question. If not, let me know. See, Luke, other religions say animals were created for humans to eat. In the Bible, God gave us a vegan diet when he created us. And God in the Bible promised to bring salvation for all people and all animals. Yes. And yeah, so again, I guess it depends. Everyone can sort of decide what their own religion is. And, if someone says, in my religion, we all have to eat flesh and blood, and someone else says, in my religion, you can't eat flesh and blood. And then in someone else's religion, it's some of us eat flesh and blood and some of us don't. Then, all right, like, who am I to say what someone else's religion is or isn't? I can only speak for myself. And if I'm representing Creation Care Church, I guess I do my best to speak for what Creation Care Church is about. But we definitely hold that what you're suggesting, Luke, that God gave us this diet. He designed us and said, this is what's very good. So this is what I want you to do, not eat flesh and blood, but rather the fruit of the tree and the plants of the ground. So that's our perspective. Let's see, I think that's the same comment. Live mercifully. It's very interesting what Peter said about Clement. But just to play devil's advocate, how do we know that those words attributed to Peter were indeed from Peter? Sorry if that's an ignorant question. No, it's not an ignorant question. And part of when I was putting this talk together, I know this is very different from a lot of the other talks that we've done. This is similar to more like the Book of Enoch talk that we did, where I'd say a lot of the people who come here have probably read the Bible or most of the Bible or familiar with the Bible, whereas some of these historical concepts and some of these historical texts that we're discussing, it's like, well, I haven't read that, so like, how can I really have much to say about it other than just, listening to what you have to say? So yeah, that's there aren't any ignorant questions when it comes to this. And yeah, the question of how we can know that this is Peter who said it, well, we can't. Just like we can't know that things that Peter says in the Bible are actually what Peter said. We can't know that. We can make that inference from certain doctrinal beliefs. We can make that inference from the preponderance of evidence. And so we can infer that these are actually the words of Peter, just like these are the words of Jesus in, the Gospels or whatever. And so when we're looking at things from a historical perspective, we don't sort of have that same certainty that we might have if we start from a presupposition saying, I just believe for whatever reason that this text is authentic. But like I said, in sort of reconstructing some of this history, we have early attestations of certain things. So pretty much all of the people that we mentioned today and all the quotes acknowledge that the Clement that Paul was talking about in his letter to the Philippians is the Clement that we're talking about. So then the question is, okay, well, which of the material is actually things that Clement is talking about? And so we get these different histories of who Clement is and what he's saying. And so then as we sort of go through this text, what we're going to do, and I know it's sort of premature to sort of draw this conclusion, but as we go through it and compare what it says with what's in the Bible, then I think that would give us a better bearing and a better place to sort of compare and say, well, is this something that Jesus and the apostles would have been teaching? Because if everything that's put in it, or maybe not everything, but like the things that we're looking at correspond to something else that's in, let's say, one of the Gospels, then it's like, oh, okay, then they're teaching things that are in alignment with what's elsewhere in the Bible. Whereas if they're teaching things that are just completely, not related to it, then it's like, well, like which one's the real one? So hopefully as we go through it the next few weeks and you get more acquainted with sort of what some of the material is in the Clementine Homilies, you'll be in a better position to make that determination. So the short answer is we can't know, but we can make a guess based on all the evidence, just like we have to make with every other text in antiquity. See, Luke, I don't think Clement was mentioned more than once in the Bible, which is why we don't know much about him, but it's nice to learn about unpopular Bible characters. Yeah, and part of the reason why, let's say, the first epistle of Clement wasn't included in the Bible, even though it was known about very early on in the church, had nothing to do with somebody maybe questioning its authenticity, but one of the criterion for being in the Bible is that it had to be written by an apostle. And since Clement wasn't an apostle, he was an apostle of an apostle, it got left out. But we now know that some of the texts in the Bible probably weren't written by apostles, but were sort of later versions. But they've already made it in because the people who were making those decisions thought that it was written by apostles. So the fact that even though it's Peter speaking, it's not Peter who's writing it, it's Clement who's writing it about things that Peter said. So that would automatically disqualify it from being part of the Bible based on the criterion that was used by the people who were putting the Bible canon together. See, Tanya, there's many people who are religious who believe that anything that was not originally added in the Bible, King James Version, was not supposed to be there. If God wanted it in the Bible, then it would be in there. These other doctrines are so important. How can we prove to them that this was technically supposed to be part of the Bible? Well, again, I wouldn't necessarily say this was supposed to be part of the Bible. This is a historical source that helps us to better understand the texts that are in the Bible and to better understand the teachings of Jesus and the apostles. So like whether something's in the Bible or not is like, okay, well, ultimately, I don't know that that is necessarily a thing. Like there are many questions about the Bible that can't be answered just from the Bible. So as Luke said, if this is the only place Clement's mentioned, how do we know more about who Clement was? Well, we can't just from the Bible. We have to go to sources outside the Bible to find out more about who Clement is. Similarly, if in the beginning of the Gospel of Luke, it says, I'm writing this to you, O excellent Theophilus, and then the only time Theophilus ever comes up again in the Bible is at the beginning of the book of Acts, where he says, just like I wrote the previous Gospel of Luke to you, well, he didn't call it the Gospel of Luke, but he's like, I'm writing you now this book of Acts to you, Theophilus. So those are the only two times Theophilus is mentioned. So if you want to know who Theophilus is, you have to go to sources outside the Bible. And so there's plenty of historical sources that help to answer these questions. So similarly, in order to better understand the Bible, we have to understand it in its historical context. And so we have to look at historical sources outside the Bible to better piece together what that context is. Or we could just ignore the history and make it up, which is what a lot of people do. Let's see, Fred, if the bishops died, maybe martyred, Peter being around could possibly still ordain Clement. I mean, I suppose that's a possibility where, let's say they had short terms and Peter was still alive. I could see that maybe being the case. But I think that the main point that I was trying to sort of make here was that there is an existing tradition that Peter directly ordained Clement because Clement directly knew Peter. And there's evidence for this throughout. And because that's basically the basis for the Clementine Homilies. Like if Clement wasn't the close associate of Peter and knew Peter well, and that Peter was the one who established him as the bishop of Rome, then basically this whole narrative would be called into question. And so I'm just pointing out all this evidence, suggesting that there is historical evidence, quite a bit of it, and even the preponderance of it would support that this is the most plausible narrative, that Clement did in fact know Peter well. And so that would not be a disqualifier for taking this material seriously. Let's see, I guess Teddy, I made a proposal to erect a monument memorial of animals that perished and were exploited in one of the cities of the world. What do you think of this proposal? Well, I think it's good to remember animals and to think about animals. I guess I'm always skeptical of any sort of monument. I always think of like God saying, "You're erecting idols. I didn't command this." And so anytime there's like a monument or statue or anything like that, I'm always like, whoa, like, let's just remember them and talk about them. But again, I don't know. I think it's definitely good to bring that to the attention of people. See, Heidi, it sort of seems like we've had that same tension through history up to today. What the original message teaching is versus a proto-orthodoxy who wants to insist, no, what we are teaching you is true. And sadly, today's proto-orthodoxy insists animals are beneath humans and not worthy of consideration. Yes, and that's part of why this information is so important to me in particular, and why I've spent so much time researching things in the space in early church history, is because I believe there was a certain time in the 2nd century, in particular, when this dominant view came into power, that like Jesus and the apostles didn't care about animals, and that they were just these like Galilean fishermen, that Jesus made all foods clean and, sent pigs to drown in a river. And like, anybody who teaches that veganism is God's ideal is following a doctrine of demons, and whatever kinds of things that sort of became the view in like the 4th century. It's like, how much of that material actually goes back to Jesus and the apostles? And so I think uncovering some of that material that's been sort of covered up by, the phrase is always that the victor rewrites the history. And so if the proto-orthodoxy ultimately wins out under Constantine and the later imperial authorities, then does that necessarily make their version of history the right one? Or if we uncover all these ancient historical sources that go back to the beginning, is it possible to uncover some of those things that have been covered up for so long? So that's kind of what I'm trying to do in part with what I'm doing here. See, Nicole, sorry I'm late. What a church family dinner. Okay, well, you're here now. You could always rewatch it afterwards. And sounds like you got to fellowship with some Christian vegan. Awesome. Let's see, Kurt, good day, everyone. Can someone please help me? Let's see, so, okay, someone's asking for help. Let's see, live mercifully, great answer. Thank you, Craig. Awesome. Glad that I was able to answer your question adequately. Patricia, watching from Alabama. Hi, Patricia. Time for maybe one more comment. Phil, I can join the congregation for only a few minutes. Okay. Well, all right. Glad that you're here. So I just wanted to sort of reiterate very quickly what we're going to be doing next time. So here we have, and I probably don't need to have Phil's comment still on the screen. All right, so the Clementine Homilies we did today was the Clement and the Clementine Homilies. And then next week, we're going to be doing the prophet like Moses, which is also called the true prophet doctrine from the Clementine Homilies. So we're going to look at sort of what the Bible says about this prophet like Moses, both in the Old Testament and the New Testament, and then what the Clementine Homilies has to say about it as far as how the apostles knew that Jesus was this prophet like Moses and how that impacted how they viewed him and why they chose to follow him. And then we're going to be looking at the key of knowledge, also known as the key of David or the key of the kingdom. So we're going to do that not next week, but the week after. And then the week after that, we're going to do the table of demons, which is based on passage in 1 Corinthians, but that the Clementine Homilies has quite a bit to say about that as well. So these are concepts that show up in the Bible, but sort of only briefly, and they're expounded on more thoroughly in the Clementine Homilies. So regardless of whether we believe that, regardless of whether you believe that the Clementine Homilies are perfectly preserved, authentic, the words of Clement and Peter, or whether you believe that this was maybe some 2nd century, 3rd century, or whatever sort of text that preserves these teachings by these people who refuse to conform to the proto-orthodoxy, but instead chose to preserve these sort of more Ebionite Nazarene doctrines and teachings. Regardless of which it is, it's a pathway that goes back to Jesus and the apostles and is preserving these teachings that are maybe not as preserved in the proto-Orthodox views. So hopefully you could join us for those talks and learn more about the prophet like Moses, the key of knowledge, and the table of demons. And so now, before we start our Zoom fellowship, let's close with a word of prayer. Our Father in heaven, thank you for everyone that you've brought here today, and we just hope that this was an encouraging and instructive message, and that you just guide us as we go through these next few topics to really better understand you and better understand your teachings and what you passed on to your apostles, and that you would like to pass on also to us, so that we can have this perfect understanding, not clouded by any sort of rewriting of history by later people, but rather just learning what you want us to know, and so that we can be the best disciples of you that we can be, and so that your light can shine through us in this world. And so we thank you for all that you do for us. We pray this in your son, Jesus' name, Yeshua HaMashiach, Emmanuel, God with us. So thanks everyone for joining us, and we look forward to having you again next week. God bless.